Today, we're going to debunk the 5 most popular myths from the world of art. You'll be surprised? Let's go. Myth number 1. Malevich's black square is the darkness of the cosmos. And here we have a whole bunch of myths that have no basis whatsoever. Some were invented by art historians, while others were created and spread by Malevich himself to build his legend. People see all sorts of things in the black square, a prophetic pixel, a magical television, an endless void of the cosmos, but all of this is just the imagination of people with vivid fantasies. Because Malevich's black square is simply a black square, and the idea to create it came to Malevich in an ordinary, everyday way. In 1913, there was a futuristic opera by Matyushin called Victory Over the Sun, for which Malevich was the set designer. The futurists rejected nature and declared human reason superior to all living things. They were like teenagers in art, denying everything and even art itself. Opera, in general, was this kind of pompous spectacle about how man asserts his active superiority over passive nature. And to visualize this, Matyushin came up with the idea that in the set design, the yellow living sun would be replaced by the black square as the most opposite, unnatural form and color, something that only a human can create. That's how the idea of the black square appeared. At first, just a black square, although it already contained a concept that didn't even belong to Malevich. It would take another 2 years to develop an entire style from this element. Suprematism in translation means the ultimate victory of form over content. He presented the black square at the 1915 exhibition along with a number of other suprematist paintings, which were essentially just variations of different black shapes. The square among them wasn't even the first, just one of many that were painted. While experimenting, Malevich discovered the simplicity of the square and knew it was the answer. A total victory over old art, entirely covering the past with solid, man-made black nothingness. The black square was his manifesto, boldly positioned as a verdict on classical art and nothing more. The black square has ideological and historical value as the first completely non-objective painting in the history of art. I can't say that this led to the aestheticization of art, rather it led to its ideologization. Ultimately, this led to a surge of mediocre art presented arrogantly. But as it happened, it's impossible to deny that it was a brilliant discovery. However, Malevich didn't have the best reputation. He was denied admission to the Art Academy several times. He was considered a mediocre artist, but he wanted recognition so much that he did everything to make his idea the first and to surround it with legends. That's why he dates the painting to 1913, 2 years earlier. What if someone else had already painted something similar? There had been black squares before him, so he made his square uneven to set it apart and make it unique. But the prosaic story of the appearance of the black square didn't give him peace, so he wrote an autobiography in which he talked about a supposed black lightning he saw in his childhood, which inspired his vision of the black square. All these inventions were eagerly picked up by art historians since it's well known that the most reliable source is the artist's own memories, especially when he really wants to embellish his mediocre past. This is like the emperor's new clothes effect when someone sees a plain black square. He's heard that it's famous for some reason, but he can't understand why. But it's so awkward to admit this that he makes up stories about the blackness of space, or the dizziness that supposedly overcame him when he looked at the painting. Editor, watch my video about the black square, where I unravel the story of Malevich in great detail. Myth number 2. Van Gogh committed suicide. Until recently, the entire art community was convinced that Van Gogh took his own life, but let's look at what really happened. The artist had just been discharged from the Saint-Rémy-de-Provence mental hospital after spending a year there. After the breakdown that ended with him cutting off his ear, he settled in a small town near Paris, Auvers-sur-Oise. He wanted to be closer to his brother Theo and at the same time be under the supervision of a doctor. During this period, he painted 1 picture a day while living in a hotel paid for by his brother Theo. Every day he took his supplies and went out to the fields, where he painted. In his new, just acquired manner, which he had been seeking all his life, he finally found that very expressive style that became a continuation of his troubled soul and by which we know him today. On one of those days, he gathered his supplies as usual and left. But a couple of hours later, he returned with a gunshot wound to his stomach. Theo immediately came to him and took care of him, but 2 days later, Van Gogh died of sepsis. When asked who did it, he replied, "Don't blame anyone, I did it myself." This last phrase, according to those present, spoken by the artist, became the basis for the theory of suicide. However, there are many inconsistencies in this theory. A few years ago, records were found that shed new light on this sad story and resolve all inconsistencies in the suicide theory. If we are to believe the suicide theory, then Van Gogh must have routinely gathered all his belongings that day and somehow managed to obtain a pistol. Others say it was a rifle used to scare away birds, go to a field near the castle, shoot himself in the stomach, throw away the pistol, and bleeding, return to the hotel. And immediately a number of questions arise. Where did Van Gogh get the weapon? There is no evidence that he ever owned one or even knew how to use it. Why would he need to scare away birds if he could simply not paint them? And why, if he was planning suicide, did he take all his painting supplies with him, as if he intended to paint? Why didn't he leave a suicide note as people who take their own lives usually do? Why did he shoot himself in the stomach when it's usually done in the head? And how is it even possible to shoot yourself in the stomach with a rifle? Why go out to a field for that and then return? All these questions have no answer in the suicide theory. And so in 2011, two researchers, Stephen Nafe and Gregory White Smith, published a new biography of Van Gogh that caused quite a stir. But it does answer all these questions. They found documents confirming that at that time, two teenagers were causing trouble in the town, one of whom was 16-year-old René Secretan. Both teenagers often joined Van Gogh at bars since he struggled with alcohol. And most importantly, they had a pistol which they used for hooligan purposes, scaring the local people. The presence of the pistol and the acquaintance with Van Gogh were confirmed by René Secretan himself, who later gave both testimony and various interviews. The investigation's authors say the two teenagers were playing near the old castle where Van Gogh settled with his belongings on July 27, 1890. They suggested that the teenagers started mocking the artist and accidentally shot him in the stomach. The artist managed to make it back to the hotel, but when answering questions, he tried to protect the teenagers. Don't blame anyone. I did it myself. People who really did it themselves don't say things like that. They don't need to justify anyone. Critics of this theory point out that neither Theo, nor the police, nor the doctor considered this case a crime. They also claim that Van Gogh was depressed and had already attempted suicide. And these are very weak arguments, because if Van Gogh himself didn't want the teenagers to be accused, how could others suspect anything else? After all, Van Gogh had been depressed his whole life. On the contrary, in the last months after leaving the clinic, he felt free and painted like crazy. Depression doesn't contribute to such wild productivity. Literally, just a couple of months before that, he made his first sale of a painting. Claude Monet praised him and he gained recognition. Why would someone take their own life when they had just started to achieve success? As for the previous suicide attempt, it really did happen in the clinic. He ate his paints and drank turpentine, but that was in the clinic during a crisis. Later, his doctor noted the artist no longer had suicidal thoughts, so he was discharged. Moreover, after that, the artist wrote, "I am trying to recover, like a person who wanted to end his life, but after finding the water too cold, tries to grab onto the shore again." In short, he's saying he tried, got scared, and gave up on the idea. If you watch my Van Gogh video, you know he was messy, smelled, was nervous, hot-tempered, drank a lot, and had one ear. He was new and a stranger in the city, and the idea that two teenage drinking buddies started bullying him, threatening him with a gun, seems quite logical to me, much more logical than the assumption that he somehow got hold of a rifle to scare away birds. He was constantly short of money, and he often denied himself food. Would he really spend money on bullets to scare away crows, when he could simply not paint them? Besides, in his later paintings, crows are often visible, he willingly painted them. Moreover, the painting Wheat Field with crows is considered prophetic by supporters of the suicide theory. Supposedly, in these birds, the artist foresaw his own end. So, decide, was he trying to chase them off or drawing them in as he sensed his end? It sounds dramatic, of course, but it's extremely unlikely. In other words, putting all the data together, the suicide theory seems completely illogical to me. full of inconsistencies, while at the same time, the theory of intentional or unintentional murder answers all these questions. Most of the art community still clings to the romantic but illogical theory of the unfortunate artist unable to handle life's hardships and lack of recognition. Sometimes it's hard for us to accept that even the greatest people are just people. They can be messy, heavy drinkers and die as a result of a trivial domestic quarrel. Watch the full Van Gogh live video on my channel, link in the description. Myth number 3. Rembrandt's financial collapse happened because of a client's revenge. There are literally legends about Rembrandt's life, but the most hotly debated question is the seemingly inexplicable collapse of his career. Why and how? From the highest peaks of commissions for the royal court and buying almost the most expensive house in Amsterdam, Rembrandt literally went bankrupt in just a few years, lost his studio, and fell to the level of an ordinary artist working for someone else's company. The classic theory says that all this happened because of his bold challenge, practically an insult, that the artist subtly threw at Dutch high society, with help from the Night Watch painting. Supposedly, he encoded such outrageous revelations in it that he crossed the line, was exiled, and deprived of major commissions. According to this theory, Rembrandt learned about a murder committed by the heroes of the painting, namely the Amsterdam Militia Company. It is claimed that the patron did not forgive all these encrypted hints and turned against the artist, ruining his life, and didn't even pay for the painting. This conspiracy theory is vividly portrayed in Peter Greenaway's film Rembrandt, I Accuse, where he goes through the entire painting and rather freely interprets almost every corner of it. He even finds the devil and condemnation in the face of Rembrandt himself, who painted himself behind the shoulder of one of the soldiers. But in reality, it's not like that at all. Rembrandt rose to fame at a very young age. His first major client happened to come to his studio when he was just 22 years old. He was so impressed by Rembrandt's talent that he started talking about him at court. And soon, Rembrandt received a commission from the Prince of Orange himself, and after that, from other influential and wealthy citizens of the Netherlands. By the age of 30, he had become the most popular artist in the Netherlands. Money was flowing in, and Rembrandt, like probably any other man his age, began spending money on expensive works of art, furniture, clothes, and soon got married. At that time, the Netherlands was the world's top trading power, and Amsterdam's corners were filled with exotic goods, furniture, sculptures, paintings, and weapons. Rembrandt loved all this, and bought large amounts without caring much about the price. A single commission from the Prince of Orange earned him 1,200 guilders, the same as 4 years' pay for a typical craftsman. The prince gave him 6 such commissions. At the height of his success, Rembrandt decided to buy himself a house and took out a 6-year mortgage on it for 13,000 guilders, one of Amsterdam's priciest houses on its most prestigious street. His logic was simple. If one painting earned him 1,200, then 13,000 equaled about 10 paintings. If needed, he would sell some antiques he valued at 30,000 guilders. It seemed like what could possibly go wrong. And here our conspiracy theorists claim that it was all about the Night Watch, that the artist's boldness was punished, people stopped commissioning paintings from him, and he went bankrupt. A beautiful story about an honest and courageous artist who challenged the corrupt criminals. However, it is well known that Rembrandt received all his 1,600 guilders for this painting, 100 from each participant. Paintings of this kind were a sort of group corporate photo, and various guild organizations would commission them to hang on the wall in the guild meeting hall, just like people do now in offices. But usually they were painted like this in an ordinary way, lining up all the participants as if on parade. Rembrandt, however, decided to create a story by separating the participants. And it turned out that, although they paid the same amount of money, the roles they got were not exactly equal, and those pushed into the background were left dissatisfied. But that didn't really matter, because the captain and the lieutenant were thrilled. The captain even made a copy for his diary and was very proud of it. This painting hung in the Rifle Company's hall for 80 years, and then it was moved with honors to the town hall. Such honors would hardly have been given to a rejected painting. You have to agree. What happened in 1642? In the very same year that the Night Watch was commissioned, Rembrandt's wife Saskia died, and she wrote a will in which she left all her fortune to their son. Rembrandt was appointed as the guardian, and thus half of his fortune instantly belonged to his underage son, and he could no longer manage it himself. Confident in his greatness, Rembrandt continued spending on trinkets. And it turned out that by 1653, 14 years after buying the house, he still owed 7,000 guilders on it. Although according to the contract, he should have paid off the debt 7 years earlier. At that time, the mortgage was provided not by a bank, but by the former owners of the house, and they filed a complaint with the city alderman. After reviewing the case, Rembrandt was ordered to pay off the debt immediately. And this is where things get really interesting. The artist didn't have that much money available, so he turned to his patrons, who lent him almost the entire amount for a year. But in a year, he definitely had to pay the money back. And half of his fortune, as you remember, belonged to his son and was untouchable. And he decides to sell his accumulated treasures, but to his horror, he only gets 5,600 guilders for them. This amount wasn't even enough to cover his debts. He was facing bankruptcy and the disgrace of debtor's prison. And then he decides to go through a procedure that was then called assignment of rights, in which all his property is sold to pay off his debts. But the artist himself is left with what he needs to continue his work. This is much better than bankruptcy and prison. He sells his house, pays off his debts, and with what's left, he rents a smaller house where he moves in with his son. But unfortunately, after this procedure, by law, he was not allowed to start or run his own business, and he was expelled from the Artists' Guild. However, his new partner and his son opened their own business as a front, where Rembrandt continued to work until the end of his life, actually retaining many distinguished clients. Technically, he was an employee, but it was nothing more than a cover. So, my friends, of course, we often want to believe in the nobility and infallibility of great people. But the reality is that even the most renowned and brilliant artists in real life can be financially illiterate, overly ambitious, and sometimes just childish and reckless. Myth number 4. An artist must be poor, and this is yet another beautiful, romantic, but completely unrealistic myth. In fact, if we look at the history of art and its most prominent figures, we'll see that the situation is exactly the opposite, but with some conditions. I'll explain now. Let's look at artists who were born in poverty but became great. Manet and Renoir, for example, they were friends, but they were so poor that they lived on just beans, sharing a tiny room that also served as their studio. But there was so little space that they had to work in turns and split the day. One worked during the first half of daylight and the other during the second. Their paintings sold for a mere 100 francs, and that money was just enough to feed themselves and pay the rent. And for their art, they also had to buy paints and canvases. Under such conditions, each painting was a commodity for them. First and foremost, they wanted to escape poverty so they could gain freedom and let their imagination and experimental tendencies run wild, without worrying about critics or buyers. They were the first Impressionists and were developing a new style that, as you now know, would revolutionize the art world, but which was completely misunderstood and rejected by their contemporaries. In such circumstances, every time they conceived a painting, they had to choose whether to paint the way their soul desired or to paint the way a potential buyer expected from them. Choosing between creativity and money while hungry led to Dimetorzok. They often had to compromise, participate in the official salon to make a name for themselves, and in fact, they had to lead a double life, one to earn a living and another to fulfill themselves. Renoir eventually gave in and took the first path, hiding his immense talent up his sleeve. And Manet spent 30 years seeking recognition, barely scraping by. And in the end, he overcame the inertia and skepticism of the rigid art world, becoming the greatest artist of modern times. He painted his boldest and most famous works, his Lilies, Haystacks, and Rouen Cathedral, when he was already wealthy, when he no longer had to fear the public's reaction or worry that he wouldn't have money for bread tomorrow. Financial freedom became a long-awaited breath of freedom and creativity for him, and that's exactly how it works. Friends, you might say, what about Van Gogh? He needed money his whole life and barely sold any paintings, but he still became great, didn't he? Yes, you're right, but Van Gogh did receive minimal support from his brother Theo, who provided his basic needs. And that's a very important point. We'll come back to it later. Learn more about Monet and Renoir in my videos. The link is in the description. Let's view this from another perspective. A lot of great artists were born into wealthy families and never lacked anything. Edouard Manet, Berthe Morisot, Leonardo da Vinci, Gustave Klimt, Henri Matisse, Egon Schiele, Salvador Dali, Picasso, the list goes on. And the money their families had didn't just not get in the way, it actually helped them get a good education and good commissions. And in general, it allowed them not to worry that nobody would buy their painting tomorrow and their family wouldn't have money to buy food. From the very beginning, they could freely give themselves over to the flight of their imagination without fearing that bad reviews or lack of sales would have a devastating effect on their situation. So it's actually due to their financial freedom that we know their magnificent works. In other words, poverty, no matter how romantic it may sound, is not a stimulus or a condition for greater productivity and creative freedom. On the contrary, it is the very shackles that every aspiring artist tries to break free from. For an artist to take creative risks, he must at least have enough money to buy materials and food, just like Van Gogh did. But wealth also has a downside. Too much money spoils the artist. When an artist's name starts selling his work by itself, it no longer matters to the artist what he paints, because people who don't understand art will buy it anyway. They're buying the artist's name, and often they don't care what he paints. Many artists, after gaining recognition, end up degenerating. That's what happened to Salvador Dali, who later in life sold blank signed canvases. The same thing happened with Picasso, who in the last years of his life painted a picture a day like a factory. The same thing happened with Andy Warhol, who put his pop art on stream in his famous factory, sometimes not even touching the paintings himself. And the same thing happened with the living Damien Hirst, who now simply puts his name on art objects with his own hands without doing anything else for them. This is done by hired artists, turning art into a printing press. As you can see, the artist's relationship with money is very complicated. There should be enough money so you don't have to deny yourself the basics and can keep creating. But having too much money often leads to the degeneration of artistic thought, turning artists into a commercial enterprise that produces goods solely for the sake of selling them. Myth number 5. There are no women among great artists. There's a common belief that women can't be good artists, but this stereotype arose as a result of historical specialization, where the profession of artist was considered exclusively male for a very long time. Until the mid-19th century, married women couldn't work independently. This role belonged to their husbands. It was assumed that a young unmarried woman could practice painting for self-education, but only until she got married. After that, she was mainly expected to focus on her family, husband, and raising children. Moreover, a woman was not supposed to be alone with a man, so any subjects involving men, especially nude ones, were unavailable to her. And that's how it almost always was, with extremely rare exceptions. And I'll tell you two stories from different times, but they will clearly show why we know so few women artists from the 16th century, the Renaissance era we recently talked about. Be sure to watch the video if you haven't seen it yet. Sofonisba Anguissola was born into an aristocratic Italian family. She showed such strong talent for drawing that soon she was painting portraits of all her family members and countless self-portraits. At the age of 27, she went to Rome and met Michelangelo, who praised her and recommended her to the nobility as an excellent portrait artist. Soon she moved to Spain, to Madrid, to the court of King Philip II, to serve as a court painter, drawing teacher, and lady-in-waiting to the 14-year-old Queen Elizabeth of Valois, the third wife of King Philip II. This was the highest honor in those times, but she couldn't even sign any of her portraits. Only members of the guild could sign portraits at that time, and a woman couldn't become one. However, after the death of Yelizaveta, the artist's position at court became unstable, and she was quickly married off. She left Madrid and almost stopped painting for a long 7 years until her husband died. And she met a new man who supported her passion for painting in every way. And she resumed her practice again. By the end of her life, she was already painting large canvases and was one of the most respected artists of her time. As you can see, she could only pursue her passion with permission, but she was not the only one. At the same time, for example, Lavinia Fontana lived, who even had her own workshop and received quite significant professional commissions. She specialized in nobility and religious subjects. During the Baroque period, Artemisia Gentileschi created impressive dramatic scenes. She became the first woman admitted to the Academy of Fine Arts in Florence during Maria Antoinetta's time. Once again, the women of suzerain. She had a court artist, Elisabeth Weigele Brandt, who created more than 800 works that became famous all over the world. And now the second story, the women version. In the time of Impressionism, in the mid-19th century, 300 years after Sapphonism, one of the first Impressionists was Berthe Morisot, whose quality and boldness of work were on par with even Claude Monet. She was one of the 7 great Impressionists who started a revolution in painting. She had a sister by blood, who was even more talented than Berthe, but she married early and gave up painting, while Berthe kept going until the very end. Before marriage, she was in love with Edouard Monet, who was already married. She knew that marriage would put an end to her career, so she got married at a very late age for those times, at 33. Her husband was Monet's brother, who was in love with Berthe and supported his wife and her passion for painting with all his heart. It's only because of this that we can now admire her magnificent works. In 19th century French society, she forged her own path. I have a separate video about her on my channel. Check it out. It's very interesting. As you can see, these two stories, though 300 years apart, are very similar. Two talented women were able to fulfill themselves in a strict world only thanks to the help of other women in power and the great fortune of finding understanding husbands. But Berthe Morisot was not alone. Right on her heels was Mary Cassatt, an American working in Paris, the second woman in the core of the Impressionists, and she, along with Berthe, became one of the pioneers of the new painting. Eva Gonzalez studied under Edouard Manet and was a rival of Berthe Morisot. Although she didn't join official exhibitions, her talent was sometimes seen as surpassing some Impressionists. Of course, I must mention the magnificent Natalia Goncharova. With her artist husband, she created Rainism. In my opinion, her amazing work showed more talent than her husband, equal to Korovin. Did you know her paintings of nude female models were once considered indecent? A woman painting a nude woman. What is that? What a scandal! The artist was put on trial and Goncharova had to leave Russia. A video about her is coming, so subscribe to stay updated. And what about Zenaida Serebriakova? This was the 20th century and Soviet era, when Russian women's emancipation was in full swing. We might never have seen such touching works if it weren't for her. I could name many more, and there would have been even more if painting hadn't been considered a man's job until very recently. This very myth we're talking about right now is false and limiting. Look, as soon as women were given the opportunity, as soon as they were allowed to dare, right away, talented female artists appeared everywhere. What about now with almost no restrictions? Now, there are just as many female artists in the hall as male artists, and this proves that artistic talent does not depend on gender. Legendary Marina Abramović, Unique Yao, Kusama, Tracy Emin, Kiki Smith, Elizabeth Payton, Carolyn Lawson. I could go on. Now that no one claims being an artist isn't a woman's job, we're seeing an unprecedented rise in art by women. Women are becoming not only artists, but also directors, producers, musicians, conductors, writers, professions that were once completely unthinkable for women, and they are providing very serious competition to men. As you can see, all these myths exist only because we want to see the world as a little more romantic. Editor, of course, subscribe to the channel, and I also have Boosty and Patreon. I would be very grateful if you subscribe, even with the smallest subscription. It will really help my channel grow. Thank you in advance, and goodbye to everyone.